Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to try to understand government venture capital, or GVC. We found this really interesting research paper.
Yeah.
It's called A Legitimacy-Based View of the Impact of Government Venture Capital on Startup Innovation, Evidence from a Transition Economy. I know it sounds a little bit dry, but it's actually got some really cool stuff in it about how governments can actually help startups, especially in places that are moving from a more centrally planned economy to a free market one, like China. So are you ready to kind of dig into this and see what we can learn?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, cool. So this study looks at Chinese startups, specifically in the biopharmaceutical and medical device industries.
Okay.
So what's so special about those industries?
Well, they're really reliant on things like patents and also working with experts outside the company.
Right.
So it makes them a really great test case for seeing if government backing actually makes a difference for innovation.
Oh, so you're saying it's like a testing ground to see if GVC actually leads to more innovation.
Exactly. So they looked at data from almost 800 companies over 15 years
Wow.
between 2002 and 2017. And they looked at how many patents these startups filed.
Okay.
Because in these industries, that's a sign that they're being innovative.
Right. Okay, so what did they find? Like, does GVC actually lead to more innovation?
Yeah, basically. The startups that received GVC funding within a 5-year window saw a 23.5% increase in patent applications.
Wow. 23.5%. So does that mean that the more money the government invests, the more innovation we're going to see?
Well, it's not quite that simple. It's not just about the money. The research actually shows that GVC is more like a stamp of approval. It gives these startups legitimacy when they're trying to attract, investors or partners or even just customers.
So it's kind of like a signal that the government believes in this company.
Exactly. And especially in China, where the government has historically played a big role,
Right.
that state backing can really help startups build trust and get the resources they need.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, but what about startups that are already really well connected or that people think are innovative? Does GVC still matter as much for them?
That's where this research gets really interesting. It turns out that GVC actually has a bigger impact on startups that don't already have those advantages.
Huh. So it's kind of like GVC levels the playing field.
Yeah, you could say that. So think about it this way. If a startup already has strong connections or a lot of awards, GVC might not help them that much.
Right.
But for those startups that don't have all that, GVC can make a huge difference.
I see. It's like that extra boost they need to get noticed.
Exactly. It helps them get connected to the resources they need, and then they can, innovate and grow.
Okay, cool. Now the study mentions something called sociocognitive legitimacy. What does that even mean?
Well, let me ask you this. Imagine you're an investor in China. Are you going to invest in a company that nobody's ever heard of or a company that the government has invested in?
Well, I'd probably feel better about the one that the government has invested in.
Right. And that's basically what sociocognitive legitimacy is. It's whether an organization's actions are seen as acceptable and appropriate in the eyes of other people and institutions.
Oh, so it's like fitting in with the norms of that community.
Yeah, exactly. And in a country like China, where having private startups is a relatively new thing, that legitimacy is really important.
Because investors and partners might be hesitant to work with a startup that they think is like outside the mainstream.
Exactly. And remember, those startups that don't have political ties or, social prestige,
Right.
they benefit the most from that legitimacy boost that comes with GVC.
It's like saying, hey, the startup is following the rules.
Yes.
They're aligned with the government's goals. It's safe to work with them.
Exactly.
So it builds a bridge between those startups and all the resources that they need to succeed.
Yeah. And that's where we get into the nitty-gritty of how innovation actually works, especially in high-tech fields. Startups often need access to outside knowledge and resources for research and development.
Like, university labs or specialized equipment, things that they might not be able to afford on their own.
Exactly. And in a country like China, where a lot of those resources are controlled by the government,
Right.
GVC can really make a difference.
Because it means that the government is basically vouching for the startup. So these state-affiliated institutions are more likely to work with them.
Exactly. It's not just about access, though. It's also about trust. When a government institution sees that the government is backing a startup, they're more likely to want to collaborate with them, share knowledge with them,
Right.
maybe even bring them into government initiatives.
So it's really about building those relationships.
Yeah, and it creates this ripple effect.
How so?
Well, when these state-backed institutions start working with GVC-backed startups,
Yeah.
It attracts other investors too.
Because now they're thinking, hey, this startup is legitimate.
Yeah, right.
They've proven themselves. It's probably a safe bet.
Exactly. It's like a snowball effect.
Mm.
That initial GVC investment helps the startup gain momentum.
Huh. I'm starting to see how GVC can actually shape whole industries. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to come back to the study. They used a kind of unique method to analyze all this data, right?
Yeah, they used what's called a zero-inflated negative binomial regression.
Okay. I'll admit that sounds a little complicated. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Basically, it's a way to analyze data when you have a lot of zeros.
Okay.
Like in this case, a lot of these startups didn't file any patents in certain years.
Right.
This method helps account for those zeros and gives us a more accurate picture of the relationship between GVC and innovation.
So it's a way to see the patterns that we might miss otherwise.
Exactly. And the results were pretty clear. They found a strong positive correlation between GVC funding and the number of patents that startups filed.
That 23.5% increase we talked about.
That's the one. And they found that the correlation was even stronger for startups that didn't have those political ties or social prestige.
Right. Again, that's showing us that GVC is really helpful for those startups that need that extra boost in legitimacy.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established that GVC seems to have a real impact on startups, at least in these transition economies. But are there any potential downsides? Like, could the government be picking winners and losers or using GVC to push a specific agenda?
That's a really good question. And honestly, it's not something that this particular study looked at.
Yeah.
They were really focused on the positive impacts.
Okay.
But they do acknowledge that there are some risks that come with the government getting involved in venture capital.
Like what?
Well, there's always the worry that GVC could be used to favor certain companies or industries, which could distort the market.
Right.
There's also the risk that it could discourage private investment.
Because venture capitalists might think, why bother investing if the government's already doing it?
Exactly.
So it sounds like it's a real balancing act.
It is.
Governments need to find a way to support innovation without stifling the free market. Well, this has given me a lot to think about. Before we wrap up this part of our discussion, I want to go back to one point that I think is really interesting. We've talked about legitimacy, access to resources, building trust, but there's also something else that GVC provides. Symbolic power.
That's a great point. That's something that often gets overlooked.
So what exactly do you mean by symbolic power?
Well, it means that GVC is more than just an investment. It's a signal to everyone that the government is serious about innovation.
Like it's a vote of confidence.
Exactly. And that can have a huge impact on entrepreneurs and investors.
Because it makes them more optimistic.
Yeah. And it can help attract talented people and resources from other countries.
So it's not just about the money, it's about the message that it sends.
Exactly.
That's a really good point to end on. This has been really insightful so far. We've learned that GVC can actually help boost innovation, especially in countries like China that are in transition. And it's not just about the cash. It's also about providing legitimacy, access to resources, trust, and even this kind of symbolic boost to the whole ecosystem.
Right.
And while there are some potential downsides, the benefits seem pretty clear. Now, before we move on, I want to leave you with something to think about. Since GVC has such a big influence on innovation, how might that affect things like technological advancements and global competition in the future?
That is the question. That's a really interesting question. It really does feel like we're seeing a shift where governments are taking a more active role in trying to, shade what technologies get developed. And the impact of that could be huge.
It's almost like countries are using GVC as a way to compete with each other.
Yeah, and it's not just about competition either. GVC can actually help countries work together.
Oh, how so?
They can use it to pool resources and expertise to try to solve problems that affect everybody.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, things like climate change or global pandemics or coming up with new clean energy solutions.
Yeah.
Those are all things that GVC could potentially help with.
That makes sense. But I guess GVC isn't like a magic bullet, right?
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It really depends on the specific context of each country.
So what kind of things make a difference?
Well, things like how developed their innovative ecosystem already is, the level of transparency in the government, and the overall political and economic climate.
Right. So it's not just about how much money you invest.
Exactly. It's about being strategic and making sure those investments are used effectively.
And I guess coordinating those investments with other policies.
Exactly.
So you're saying it's about creating a whole ecosystem that supports innovation.
You got it. It's really hard to say what the future holds.
Yeah.
but I think it's safe to say that GVC is going to be a big part of it.
This study was specifically about China, but are there other countries that are doing interesting things with GVC?
Yeah, definitely. There are a lot of really cool examples from around the world. Like Israel, for instance.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about them.
They've been really successful at using GVC to build a strong tech sector, especially in areas like cybersecurity and AI.
I think I read somewhere that their YARSMA program is like a model for other countries.
It is. It's a great example of how GVC can attract private investment.
So it's not just about the government putting in money.
Right. It's about creating the right conditions for private investors to come in and do their thing.
So other countries are trying to do similar things.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in the U.S., the government has been investing a lot in clean energy technology.
Right.
Through programs like ARPE.
And in Europe, they have the European Innovation Council.
Exactly. So it seems like a lot of governments are starting to realize how important it is to support innovation.
I see. Now, this brings up an interesting question. If GVC becomes more common, what happens to traditional venture capital?
That's a great question. And it's something that people are still trying to figure out. Some experts think that GVC might actually crowd out private investment.
How so?
Well, if venture capitalists see that the government is already investing in a company, they might be less likely to invest themselves.
Especially if they think the company is more focused on pleasing the government than on making a profit.
Exactly. But other people argue that GVC can actually complement private investment.
Okay, I could see that.
By, reducing the risk for early-stage investments, validating promising technologies, and attracting private capital to markets that might have been overlooked before.
So it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right. It's about finding the right balance and making sure that public and private investment are working together to support innovation.
And I guess that balance will probably look different depending on the industry and the specific technology.
Absolutely. Like in industries that are really new or where it takes a long time to develop a product, GVC might play a bigger role.
Right, because they might need that patient capital.
Exactly. But in industries that are more established, private investment might be the main driver.
So it's really about tailoring the approach to each specific situation.
You got it.
This is all really fascinating, but it also seems incredibly complex. How can governments and private investors actually work together effectively?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no easy answer. But I think transparency and communication are key.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, governments need to be clear about their goals for GVC. And they need to talk to private investors to understand their concerns.
And private investors need to be open to working with governments.
Exactly. And they need to understand how GVC can help them manage risk and access new markets.
So it sounds like building trust is really important.
It's essential. And that trust takes time and effort. It comes from having open conversations, collaborating on projects, and working together to achieve shared goals.
Okay, so let's say we've got this system where governments and private investors are working together. How do we actually know if it's working? Like, what should we be measuring besides just the number of patents?
Yeah, that's a great point. Patents are one indicator of innovation, but they don't tell the whole story.
So what else should we be looking at?
Well, we should look at how many jobs are being created, how much the economy is growing, and whether these investments are leading to new products and services that actually benefit society.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And we also need to think about the long-term sustainability of these investments.
So are we creating an ecosystem that can support itself?
Right.
Or are we just propping up companies that would fail without government help?
That's the question.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We've talked about how GVC can boost innovation. We've looked at the idea of sociocognitive legitimacy and how that can help startups gain credibility. And we've discussed the potential risks and challenges of government involvement in venture capital. But before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to come back to one key concept: legitimacy. We talked about how GVC can give startups that stamp of approval. But is there a risk that this could create a culture of dependency?
That's a great point. It's a tough balance. On the one hand, GVC can help level the playing field, and it can create opportunities for startups that might not get noticed otherwise. Right. But if startups become too reliant on government funding, it could actually stifle their creativity.
It's like they never learn to stand on their own 2 feet.
Exactly. So governments need to design these programs in a way that encourages entrepreneurship and self-reliance.
So maybe focus on providing early stage funding And then encourage startups to seek private investment as they grow.
Exactly. And it's also important to create a culture of mentorship.
Right, so that startups can learn from people who have been there before.
Exactly.
The goal is to build an ecosystem where startups can thrive even without government support.
Absolutely. It's about creating a virtuous cycle where GVC leads to innovation, which attracts private investment, which leads to even more innovation and growth.
And ultimately, a more prosperous society for everyone.
Precisely.
This has been such a great conversation. But before we wrap up completely, I'd love to hear your final takeaway. What's the one thing you want listeners to remember from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that GVC is really powerful. And it's becoming more and more important for shaping, the future of innovation. But it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about legitimacy and access and building trust. And ultimately, it's about working together to create a better future through innovation.
So it's not just about helping individual companies succeed. It's about using GVC to create a whole system that supports innovation and benefits everyone.
Exactly. It's complicated.
Yeah.
But it's something we really need to pay attention to, especially as the world of innovation is changing so rapidly.
Well said. I think this deep dive has given us all a lot to think about. We've explored how GVC can boost innovation, especially in those transition economies. We've looked at that idea of sociocognitive legitimacy and how that stamp of approval from the government can make a big difference for startups. And we've also talked about the potential risks of GVC, like, the need for transparency and finding that balance between government support and private investment. It's a lot to take in. But I think the big takeaway here is that GVC is a really powerful tool, and it's something that's going to have a huge impact on the future of innovation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's a really fascinating area, and I think we need to keep learning about it and talking about it if we want to use it effectively.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought. This study focused on how GVC affects startup innovation, but it also pointed to something much bigger. The possibility that GVC can not only help individual companies, but actually shape entire industries, drive economic growth, and even help us address some of the biggest challenges facing the world today.
That's a great point. It's not just about creating the next big tech company. It's about using innovation to make a real difference in the world.
So in a way, it's not just an economic strategy, it's a societal strategy.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that investing in innovation is investing in the future.
That's a powerful idea. So as you go about your day, think about the role that GVC might be playing in your life. From the technology you use, to the medicines you take, to the overall health of the economy, it's a deep dive that never really ends. Thanks for joining us.